Okay, Jamie.
Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Anthem Memory Care educational webinar, Caregiving at Home and How to Sleep Well at Night. At Anthem, we believe that supporting families on the dementia journey means not only caring for the residents in our home, in our communities, but also empowering caregivers at home with knowledge, resources, and encouragement. That's why we are proud to host these free monthly webinars to provide education, connection, and peace of mind. We are delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, LaVon Lenaway, founder and owner of Dragonfly Senior Navigation Services in Illinois. LaVon is a gerontologist, educator, and consultant in navigating dementia care with over 26 years of experience in advocacy, senior living support group facilitation, and education. She holds a Master's of Arts in Gerontology from Concordia University and brings a wealth of knowledge and compassion to her work. LaVon is deeply committed to helping families and professionals alike addressing concerns about dementia care, promoting self determination, and providing valuable education and resources. And she does all of this with warmth, humor, and empathy, which makes her guidance not only informative, but truly encouraging. Please join me in welcoming LaVon Lenaway as she leads us in this important conversation on caregiving at home and finding ways to rest well at night. LaVon?
Hi, thank you very much for that nice warm welcome. I appreciate that. It's nice to be here. Hello from the western suburbs of Chicagoland and Illinois. Nice to be a part of this opportunity. So thanks again for the invitation and the warm welcome. I'm going to start out by just kind of introducing myself. Typically, if I was doing an in-person presentation, I would ask who's in the room. I think I've got a pretty good idea that the people that are here with us are responding well to the title that we named this of sleeping well at night. And so that's kind of a common theme that comes up in support groups that I lead. It's a common problem that we have with caregivers. And so it's that's probably my audience of who's weary, right? But I don't want to assume that's the case. We may have some staff here. We may have some family members. We may have other professionals here. So welcome, everybody. It's nice to have you here. Just a quick introduction to me. You kind of heard the introduction, but I have worked in a variety of different settings, from adult day services to independent HUD housing, which is for low-income folks. I've worked in private pay memory care communities, and a variety of other kind of ancillary services to that. So, but nobody really has to care about that. I think what gives me a little bit more credibility than that is that in my own family, dementia has played its part. And so my mom had a diagnosis of vascular dementia, and my in-laws both had dementia. My father-in-law passed away, unfortunately, in the last year or so from a vascular dementia. And my stepmother-in-law continues to be in memory care with Alzheimer's disease with psychotic breaks. So we're still getting those texts. We're still getting those phone calls. I'm still in the trenches. So that is really what makes us the experts, right? Is living and breathing this. So just know that I sat on a variety of the different sides of the table when it comes to dementia conversations. So the objectives here, I had a much longer list, but I wanted to keep it a little bit shorter. So I'm just going to kind of read through this, but at any point, if you want to chime in with some questions, or we'll take the questions at the end, either way is fine with me. The objectives is that we want to know how to know when additional help is needed as a caregiver, what help options there are, and how do I know what's the best fit for my situation. What are some benefits of the outside dementia trained services for the caregiver and the person living with the diagnosis? How do I plan well for the future? The benefits of early intervention. How do I prepare my home for care if that's the choice you're making? How do I respond in a crisis? How do I navigate guilt, resentment, and fear? So we're going to talk about a lot of the emotions that come along with this role. And then navigating the promises that we've maybe made with our family members prior to any diagnosis that we just have to kind of reconcile now that we're in a completely different situation. So every single individual situation is different. And it's tempting to compare our stories to others. When I worked in a memory care community one time, a group of sisters wanted to sit down with the leadership and say that we were doing things differently with their mother than the other ladies because she was progressing faster than the other ladies in her group of friends. And so we had to have this long conversation explaining that there's a lot of different contributing factors as to why some people might be going through the disease faster than others, right? So comparison comes with a risk. We don't really want to, while we want to collaborate with other caregivers and we want to be friends with other people who have loved ones with dementia, we want to be real cautious when we kind of look at their story and their situation and make comparisons. So we need to stay in our own lane. Because there's so many things that we don't have control over. So hereditary features, different comorbidities, maybe they're different ages, right? Different dementia diagnosis or combinations of more than one diagnosis, and then different dementias presenting differently and moving at different paces. So, or just different other medical issues along with the diagnosis. So that makes everybody pretty much on their own journey, even though there are some similarities along the way, right? Oops. So we want to trust the professionals for the most part. We all know of some faulty professionals out there, but for the most part, we need to lean on the expertise of the professionals. What I like to say, what I used to say when I worked in memory care and what I like to say in support groups now is that you family members are the expert in knowing the individual and knowing the person, what they like, what they don't like, what their history was, what their career was, what their past traumas were, their favorite foods, all these things. You're the expert on the person, and the professionals are the expert on the disease. And ultimately, you work together to collaborate because you both need to know what the other person knows, right? So we want to make sure that we're cautious about poor information online and social media. I myself am watching social media all the time and a bit appalled, really, to see how much not helpful information is out there, or just poor examples of caregiving without dignity and respect, to be very honest. So wrong information kind of elicits fear, and it tries to manipulate us oftentimes into buying things. And so if you're in a crisis, if you're scared, if you're tired or exhausted, there are people right around the corner kind of wanting us to buy what they want to sell or, buy into something. We want to trust the professionals for the most part, like the doctors, the neurologists, psychiatrists, because they're the experts on the disease. And we want to communicate our concerns and questions with them frequently. So it's not just one appointment, now we have it and we're off and on our own. We want to be in constant communication with them because the disease often changes and progresses, right? There's some exceptions, but for the most part, there's a progression. So we have to stay in constant conversations. It's similar to somebody that might have diabetes and they're given medications, but it's just not that one medication at that dose for the rest of the journey. It's always being tweaked. It's always being modified. It might be switched out or another med might be added to it. It's the same concept that as we're progressing, we're always in constant conversation. And don't be shy about asking. So your questions may pertain to something important and there may be simple answers. And so you might be worrying about something that might have a pretty simple answer to it. We just kind of have to get past our pride to ask the question. I put up here 4 different websites that I consider reliable websites. Because if I tell you not to trust things that are online or social media, I at least want to steer you towards websites that are reliable. So alz.org, which is a website for the Alzheimer's Association. Even if the person that you're thinking of and caring for about doesn't have Alzheimer's disease specifically, they help with anybody that has any kind of dementia, memory loss, confusion. There's a lot of really great information there that's well researched and backed up by physicians. NIH is the National Institutes on Health, Mayo Clinic, and Cleveland Clinic. So those are great places to start with your questions if you want to just start online. So when do I ask for help? There's no wrong time. So getting the answers to your question helps you sleep better at night, right? So we're going to circle back to the title. The reason that I chose this picture is that I just said this maybe 3 times earlier this week in different environments where we get to this fork in the road And there's kind of two choices as far as I can see. We can go one direction where we are working out of prevention, where maybe hypothetically we say something like, okay, October 1 is when we're going to start asking for in-home care, or bring our loved ones to adult day services, or move our loved one into a memory care community. Like, we're going to pick a date, and out of prevention, we're going to choose to do this. The other direction that we can go in the road is to do what I think most Americans do, even my own friends and family. I've seen this happen, even myself, to be very honest. We wait for a crisis to shove us into the next part of the journey, right? So we can either work out a prevention, which is rare but not unheard of, or we wait for the crisis. Here's what happens is that when we wait for a crisis, we haven't done all of our research, right? So when I say the sooner the better, what I'm saying is we can at least be doing some phone calls. We can at least be doing some tours. We can be interviewing different services. And so maybe we're not ready for it now, but at least we can be well informed that when the crisis does come, which might be inevitable, at least we can make informed decisions, because we know quite clearly that none of us want to make hard decisions when we're in a crisis situation. All right, so what does help look like at first, right? So we want to get questions answered from our professionals. We want to use educational resources. A lot of libraries, for example, are making their own areas that have to do with dementia, either resources or activity kits and things like that. So the communities are starting to catch on that this is a need. They've just had enough people come into the library and ask the questions that they're now reaching out to people like myself and saying, what do we need to have here so that we can support these caregivers coming into the library? Free classes, either through the library or webinars like this, senior centers, local memory care communities, attending support groups that are in your local area, maybe talking to people in your book club or your study groups, maybe talking to people in your hobby groups, speaking to people at your church, synagogue, or temple. It's a personal clinical therapist might be able to help you kind of launch the conversations and first steps. Maybe using spiritual readings and quotes to at least kind of ground you for the start of the journey. I find podcasts to be very helpful on lots of different topics, right? And so you're just listening while you're cooking or cleaning or driving. And that's a nice use of downtime. And then caregiving books. If you just go to Amazon and type in caregiver books, a plethora of them will come up. I'm not saying that all of them are the greatest, but there's plenty of people that have either written their own memoirs, or there are doctors that have written their research. So you kind of have to choose what kind of book you're looking for, but they are plentiful, right? So where do I turn when this is not enough? So you're doing kind of your groundwork, you're doing kind of your conversations, and then we kind of turn it up a notch, you might say. So we might start attending a memory cafe. If you don't know what a memory cafe is, it's quite a phenomenon that's taking root in the US. This is a website here, and maybe we can share it also in the chat later on. But Dementia Friendly America has a directory where you can look up your local area and see if there are any memory cafes available. A memory cafe is where a caregiver and a person living with a diagnosis can attend an event together, and it's a dementia friendly environment. It could be at a library or a restaurant or some space in the community where it is a safe space, where maybe there's a speaker, maybe there's an activity, maybe there's singing, but it is a place that's intentionally created for those that might have a hard time either ordering at a restaurant or participating in a group, or even maybe going to church or things like that. If a person talks out loud or is walking around, this is a very safe place to go. It also just gives a little bit of respite to caregivers that their loved one is being a little bit entertained, you might say, or engaged in an age-appropriate activity. We want to make sure that we're looking at home modifications, because we know, aging alone is progressive, right? But also this disease is progressive. So if we need to look at what to do with stairs in our home, if we need to add ramps, different rails or things in the shower to make us prevent falling. Those home modifications, the sooner the better, right? And so we want to also use respite programs. So in Illinois, we have particular programs, but I understand that we have several states represented here, so I don't want to kind of pigeonhole us into just Illinois, but you can reach out to your local area agency on aging and ask them what kind of services they have. Those are the same folks that might be able to tell you where your local support groups are. So that's a really great place to start. And in general, it's our taxpayers that are paying for those services. So why not, right? Oftentimes they're free. We want to start at least investigating in-home care. That's worth interviewing about and researching and asking around, because like all services, there are great ones and not great ones, right? So adult day services is a great form of respite for caregivers, where a person still lives at home, but they go to this community for the day and then return home at the end of the day. Supportive living, again, that's a term from the state of Illinois, so I won't go into too deep of detail there. I don't want to confuse anybody. Assisted living, skilled care, and then using a consultant to kind of help navigate these kind of things, right? So maybe starting at your local area agency on aging to give you some referrals to that. That's a kind of like a nice broker way to start. But having a professional who is in and out of these communities, in and out of taking tours, but also in the know about who's running specials, who has vacancies, who just lost their executive director, who has a brand new director of nursing. These consultants stay on top of this all the time, right? So just really, and oftentimes they're free. So, but we do want to just make sure that we're not putting our own personal information on the internet for any willy-nilly free service, right? So you want to be careful about who you're giving your contact information to. All right, so who are my helpers and my stakeholders? I've intentionally put a three-legged stool here. We always want to start with our doctors, primary doctors, because they start with things that are important, like blood tests and just different diagnostic tools to rule out things that have nothing to do with dementia, right? So maybe they're looking at urinary tract infections or, glucose levels and things like that. But we always want a really good physical from our primary doctor. We want to talk to a neurologist if we are noticing memory impairment or cognitive concerns. And then a neuropsychologist would be recommended to us if we really needed that form of testing. So in the next few slides, we're going to talk about how a diagnosis is made. And what I've kind of gathered is that there's this three-legged stool. We have what caregivers are writing down and reporting to doctors as the symptoms, right? So I always encourage caregivers to grab a notepad, write down the day of the week, like the date, the time of the day, and the occurrence that you noticed, like the situation you were in, or what you observed, right? So on August 30, my husband at 3:00 went out to the mailbox and didn't come back. And then when I went outside, he was around the house looking at the flowers. September 3, my wife decided she was going to take a shower, went into the bathroom, put on another sweater, and then came back out. So, or I'm noticing that the bills aren't getting paid, or I'm noticing that the meds aren't being taken, or they're maybe taken incorrectly, or the dog was always taken care of and now the dog is not being taken care of, or the house used to be immaculate and now it's not. So those are the symptoms and things that you want to kind of write down, because that information is telling the doctor something, right? And the neurologist something. The second leg of the stool is what the neurologist is doing, and there's going to be some other slides in the coming up that kind of talk about what those neurologists are looking at. But a local, very well-known neurologist here one time was talking about how we can, with 100% certainty, find out what the diagnosis is, or it used to not be that way. We used to say that we don't know what the diagnosis is until after an autopsy. Well, that's not the case anymore. We can figure out what's causing the dementia. But what this neurologist said to me is that you can't treat a scan. You need the information from his or her test. You need the symptoms that the caregiver is offering, and you need the results from neuropsychological testing. So those are the three legs of the stool. And together with those three things, we can now with 100% certainty figure out what the diagnosis is that's causing the dementia. But we also want to start looking at our home health services, using physical, occupational, and speech therapies, financial planners, maybe not for everybody, but for some people, reverse mortgages might be an important conversation, elder law attorneys, hospice services, funeral home professionals, and getting those kind of taken care of and prepaid, and then using private case managers if we just need somebody to help us navigate all this. Obviously, this is a lot of work and it's very time consuming, and it can be a little overwhelming. So early intervention is ideal. You've probably heard about this. Why is this ideal? It might be challenging to seek help early when things don't feel so bad and they're manageable. So again, rarely do any of us wake up in the morning and say, today I'm just going to start doing this really emotionally laden, hard thing, preparing for the future. Like, we just are not prone to do that. Many family caregivers don't want to admit that there's a problem because it will demand a response from us, and it will affect our work, time, money, energy that we may or may not have, or we just don't want to spend it on this topic, right? And honestly, very practically speaking, we might just be putting things off because we're trying to save a little money. Like, well, there's no emergency yet. We're doing okay. Let's try one more month because that'll save one more month of fill in the blank finances for whatever service. But truly early intervention is really ideal. So why? Some medications for our early stages, and maybe you've heard about these lately on the news, are coming out that slow down the progression of the disease, but they are best suited for early stages of dementia, right? So very practically speaking is that the sooner that we get the medication started, if they're eligible for those meds, the better off we'll be. So that's kind of a pretty simple explanation. The one diagnosed with dementia can be a part of the conversation, right? So they can help with preparations for the future. Maybe they can even go on tours of different places and say, don't you dare put me here, or I can see myself here. Having their opinion really matters if that's still an option. Also, there may be a very tiny window where legally an elder law attorney is allowed to have them sign legal forms that have to be signed before the diagnosis kind of sets on its way. And so if an elder law attorney sniffs out for a minute that a person has any cognitive impairment, ethically speaking, they would not be able to have have your loved one sign forms. And that's okay. That happens sometimes. But like we're going to talk about in a little while, that just becomes much more expensive down the way because you've missed that gap for your powers of attorney for healthcare, powers of attorney for estate, all these, the wills, the living wills, those kind of things, because they're not capable of signing their own name cognitively, right? Maybe physically, but not cognitively. And so the next step would be going through guardianship. Again, possible, but it just gets much more expensive and it becomes more clunky. So getting those paperwork ducks in a row sooner than later is really, really important. So the one living with a diagnosis can give their opinions about types of care, what kind of community they might prefer, and what their non-negotiables are, right? And that is literally treating other people how we would want to be treated ourselves. This is the heart of my trainings, is that we treat others how we would want to be treated. And so I have strong opinions about what I like and what I don't like, what I would prefer, and what I would prefer not to have involved in my care one day. And so having them have a say is how we would want to be treated. And then there's an increased likelihood that the wishes of the one living with a diagnosis are met and respected because they've had ability to either put them in writing or have the conversations, and so that the decision makers know and hear those things. So what is the lack of, so we all have the right to not plan that, right? If we just say, oh, for Pete's sake, my parents didn't do that, I don't see the need for it, it all worked out for them, or are we just too busy right now with the kids, or whatever is kind of cognitively giving us pause. There's just some residual things that happen because of that. So our legal fees down the road might be much higher if we go into guardianship. A doctor may say we need 24/7 care, like say if an emergency happens, and now we're left going wherever there's an open bed available. We don't get the choice of, this or this place. We go wherever there's an open availability. And oftentimes that's maybe not where we would choose, but it's the only option, right? It can be a very high stress situation and add to our anxiety if we haven't looked around, if we haven't done the research, if we haven't made the phone calls, if we haven't started building those professional relationships. And a caregiver's life, work, hobbies, routines, family are greatly interrupted. Maybe you are already familiar with this, that if we're not doing things out of prevention, it lands up being kind of a crisis for not just the person living with a diagnosis, but the immediate caregivers and the surrounding community, right? So this last example of my phrase is lack of planning on your part creates an emergency on everybody else's part. That's not the true quote, but that's what it looks like. Because if we have a situation that is a crisis, we call on our community, which is okay, right? So many of us have neighbors, friends, people from our church, people from our support groups that might come running towards our situation and help us and be with us. But for how long, right? And so at what point do they become exhausted and feel like they can't keep up with it and can't keep giving? Of course, in an emergency, in course of a crisis, people show up, but there is a amount of life to that we can expect. And then people have to move on with their days too, right? So we just have to land up respecting that our helpers might need to return back to their places. So oftentimes we forget about if a caregiver lands up in the ER. This was just a conversation out of one of my support groups this past week of, I'm the only one. We don't, all of our family lives out of state. Our kids are not really involved, nor do we really want them to be involved, or whatever your story is. Caregivers are not invincible, and caregivers land up at the hospital. And now we have a situation where somebody who cannot be left alone is in harm's way, right? Because we have an emergency of the caregiver. So when the crisis occurs, we need to have our legal documents, like our power of attorney for healthcare and living will, close. I heard a professional recently say, keep it in the glove box, because chances are your car is going to the hospital or the doctor's office or something like that. That's at least closer than the file cabinet, right, in your office at home that's locked, So keeping it in the glove box of your car is about as close to where you are all the time as possible. Call the exception is probably if there's a do not resuscitate form that, at least in the state of Illinois, should be hanging on the fridge, not in the freezer like it used to be, but at least on the fridge, because in the state of Illinois anyways, paramedics look first to the refrigerator for a do not resuscitate form. It might be different in different states. We want to call our emergency contacts and let them know of the situation. We want to work closely with a discharge planner or social worker in the hospital on the details and expectations for discharge for our loved one or for ourselves, right? And then we really want to be wary of, not weary, I spelled that wrong, wary of high pressure sales, right? Because now hospitals are even putting senior services in the hospitals and making it kind of feel like that's your choice, right? Like when you leave this hospital, you go down to the first floor and you swing by this home health agency or whatever service this is, and that's who you use. And that gives me caution, because we are allowed the right of choice, right? And so hospitals who are now giving space to different businesses are kind of pigeonholing all of us into making us think that that's our only choice. And that's not the case. Once we get out into the community, there's all kinds of choices. And so I want to know that I have a right to choice. So we, again, do not want to give people our personal information on any website until we know it's a trusted service. When a crisis hits or occurs, we want to start learning to trust other care providers and relinquish some of our control. Ooh, that's a hard one, isn't it? We want to start learning to say yes to outside help, either our organic community or professionals. And we have to start learning to trust the dementia professionals. And sometimes that's hard because we don't understand the why behind what they're doing. But again, you're the expert on your loved one, they're the expert on the disease. And the more you communicate and work together, the better off the person living with the diagnosis is, right? And so never being shy about asking the questions, but also not being upset and angry because you don't understand what's going on. Simply asking the question. I think any professional would love to answer questions about what you may not understand. You want to make sure that you set boundaries so that you get your sleep, that you're eating well, and drinking enough water. If you've ever sat vigil in a hospital room, you know that just that sitting vigil can be completely exhausting, right? It can deplete you. Let alone the junky food that they feed you in the cafeteria. You're not drinking water, and you're not showering like you usually do, and you can feel pretty yucky pretty fast, right? If you're doing that day after day sitting in the hospital. So high stress situations can affect your sleep, diet, energy level. It can affect our ability to make educated decisions. I mean, even when my parents passed away, one of the letters from the hospice company said, make sure you don't make any big decisions for a year after the passing of your loved one. There's a reason that they say that, right? Because when we're in a stressful situation, or if we're in grief or these strong emotions, making decisions is not the thing that we should be doing if we can avoid it at all costs. They are just coming out of a different motivation than a well-researched, well-informed situation. High stress situations affect our relationships with our loved ones. It affects our spiritual beliefs sometimes, of like when hard things or bad things happen, scary things happen, maybe some of us start questioning the goodness of God, or the purpose of all of this, or the meaning behind all of this. And so it can shake us when that's a thing that oftentimes people use to ground themselves in scary moments. It's oftentimes a time where we start feeling the foundations under us shaking a little bit, right? Because we're not seeing clearly. Resentment can find its way into these conversations. Oftentimes I hear about this proverbial son in California that never does anything and never comes to visit. And I was in a training the other day and they were laughing, and I'm just like, did I say something? They're like, no, we actually have a brother in California and he doesn't do anything. And so I always like to use the example of this random family member in California that doesn't seem to show up. But so increased feelings of being alone. Nobody understands my situation and nobody understands what I'm going through. They say that, this is what comes up in support groups so often of, oh, your husband looks good today, or your wife looks like she's doing okay. And it just kind of is like nails on a chalkboard to caregivers to hear those phrases, because it's not, right? It's broken, they're grieving, it's messy, and it's hard. And saying they look good doesn't sound right in their ears. And then your physical health could be in danger as well, right? So I have a list here. I'm not going to read all those big words, but the point is that our body will pay the price, right? I think there's a book that is called The Body Keeps the Score. And that is that our body responds to stress over a long period of time. And there are implications to that. So we have to be at least self-aware of our bodies and see if things are happening while we're in the heart of caregiving, and be very careful to reach out for help if we sense that any of these body systems are struggling, and just recognizing that it could be the stress level in our life. That doesn't fix the problem, but being aware of it is really monumental. So stress and health is impaired communication. This impaired communication has been linked to the future development of numerous physical and mental health conditions, including chronic fatigue, metabolic disorders like diabetes, obesity, depression, and immune disorders. So oftentimes I don't actually like to ask caregivers, what are you doing to take care of yourself? Because caregivers don't like to hear that question. That just feels like more is being asked of them. But as an alternative, I just want to raise awareness of what can be happening and what we should be aware of, no matter what. If we're taking care of ourselves or not, there are some things to be concerned about. And where do I start in my preparing? This is kind of a review. We're kind of wrapping up our time here. We want to start with our primary physician to rule out all of these other medical conditions or concerns. We want to visit with a neurologist if the physician thinks that's a good idea. Maintain visits to all of our other specialists, right? So if we see a podiatrist or an oncologist or a cardiologist or any of these other doctors, if dementia enters our storyline, we don't stop going to all these other doctors. For example, it's my understanding that there's some urinary incontinence medication that we have now found has to do with memory impairment. So we want to make sure that if we're seeing a urologist, that doctor is familiar with what we're dealing with when it comes to dementia, because those professions intertwine, right? And so just making sure that we're aware that all of them need to be talking to each other when it comes to medications and treatments. We want to meet with our elder law attorney and get those ducks in a row before, sooner than later. Maybe that's number one, right? Like maybe that's the top priority. If the cost of an elder law attorney is too much, at least start with your local senior services, because they can oftentimes help with just a simple will and some of the paperwork. So if going straight to an elder law attorney feels very overwhelming and too costly, there might be some alternative things in your state to help with at least some simple free paperwork. Financial planners, maybe working along an elder care consultant, like me in our area, but if there may be somebody like me in the area where you live, to really kind of, we have been in this arena, for example, myself for 26 years. I know where I would send my mom if she ever needed somebody for dementia care. She's passed away, but I know where I would trust them with my parent. I know where I would not send my parent, right? And so there's a lot of wisdom and a lot of insight speaking to professionals who have just been in the arena for so many years. And we want to see a family mediator if we're not all seeing eye to eye, right? So maybe there's several family members that have different motivations, different focuses, different ideas about what's happening. And using an outside professional like a family mediator is really, really helpful. I've worked with several families who just needed that professional to step in to navigate the conversation because they knew they couldn't do it on their own based on their family history. And we want to work closely with a clinical therapist just for our mental health, right? So putting our hand up and saying, I need somebody outside of all of this to just listen to me. It's an opportunity to navigate grief, fear, loss, resentment, all of these strong emotions that come with the role as a caregiver. And then we really want to seek out support groups. I am quite biased towards them. I lead about 10 of them in the western suburbs of Chicagoland, but I see so much value in seeing people connect with their peers over a really, really hard topic, right? And to get those nods of understanding on the entertaining small gifts and blessings that they're experiencing, but also on the hardest of the hard days. So they have somebody maybe that they can text on a good day or a bad day, somebody that they can hug if they see them in the hallway of a memory care community. But building those relationships is so, so important, because the number one thing caregivers say is that I feel alone and I feel scared, right? And so making sure that we're not alone really is a huge part of the conversation. Is your home ready for the future? So we want to, you can have actually a professional come into your home and evaluate your home to make sure that it's ready. But you can also do some of this first steps on your own. So we want to See if maybe we can make sure that there's a bedroom on the main floor, alleviating any need for stairs. We want to look for fall risks, removing rugs, toys, table legs that stick out. I have a neighbor across the way who is walking with a walker and walking her dog. And I had family visit the other day, and she was like, that lady is going to fall because she's going to trip over her dog. And I thought, absolutely, you're right. You see the same thing I do. So sometimes pets with leashes and things, or cats that get underfoot, can become a fall tripping hazard, right? Like, I don't want to be anti-pet, but because there's plenty of benefits to having a pet, but we need to see them as a tripping hazard as well. Is the lighting in a home bright enough? So a person with dementia needs 3 times more light than the rest of us. And so that reduces depression, that reduces falls. So do we need to change out our light bulbs for something brighter or add more lights? Is the shower walk-in accessible? Or is there a bath bench available for sitting? Are the doorways wide enough for a wheelchair to get through? Are the floor colors contrasting? So if you have like a light colored carpet, go to a hardwood floor that's a darker wood. A person with dementia might get caught in that threshold, right? Because they don't know if they're going to step up or step down because of that change in color in the flooring. So that becomes a fall risk. Are the meds locked away? So one of the things that happens with dementia is that they no longer understand the meaning of things and may get time and date and scheduling things mixed up. So when it comes to meds, we want to make sure that meds, detergents, soaps, paint, chemicals of any kind are all put away because they misunderstand the meaning of things and might think that they should eat something that should not be eaten. Are knives and chemicals locked away? So especially for anybody that has any form of hallucinations, we would just want to make sure that anything dangerous has been locked away or put out of reach. We can go into that some other training, but there's a reason I'm saying it. Other safety ideas, if you have your loved one at home or even in a community, right? So you want to make sure that your loved one is registered at the police department with a photo, so that if either the police find them out on the street sometime, that they can get them back home safely, or maybe they don't remember what their address is, or if they're in the community and can't report accurately who they are. So having them in the registry with the police department is a really good first step. Maybe also at least wearing a safety alert bracelet if they can handle it, right? So maybe for somebody that might be an annoying feeling to them, there's necklaces, there's bracelets, there's watches, and all kinds of different ways to, but that is also alerting the community that this person has a medical condition of some sort. We want to let our neighbors know of the situation so that they can be observant of any unusual behaviors. Oftentimes we hear that story of our loved one going to the wrong house because our neighbor's house looks like our house, right? So at least letting our neighbors know, even very vaguely, that if my loved one comes to your house, just here's my phone number, just give me a call and I'll come get them. They don't maybe have to know all the details of your story. The emergency response button might work for a little while at the beginning of the journey, but it's a new kind of technology that might be hard for a person with dementia to fully understand. So at some point it becomes not the right tool, because if a person with dementia falls on the floor, the thought process of, oh, there's a button around my neck or on my wrist that I'm supposed to push, and then somebody comes and gets me, that is a very new thing, and it's not a part of their old memory, right? And so it may not be effective at some point. Introducing that to them sooner than later might be helpful. Medication management systems, so setting reminders and alarms under a locked medication distribution, or having in a community, having the nurse distribute the meds, of somehow controlling those meds so that the person is not doing even over the counter. Like, we don't even want a bottle of Pepto-Bismol. We don't want Tums. We don't want even over the counter meds sitting out, because they aren't going to remember if they took it or not, or how many, how often, those kind of things. So we want to be educated on hospice services too. There's a lot of misunderstandings about hospice, but there's a lot of real beautiful benefits of being on, of receiving hospice services. you may not be ready for hospice yet. And so me just saying that word might trigger some people. And I apologize if it's too soon to bring that topic up. But it's a great time for us to be interviewing them. So our Medicare right, who is a legal right to use whatever a hospice company we want, even if your hospital is recommending their hospice. Again, that's kind of one of those examples of how some health systems are trying to influence our decision on using who they contract with, but you are allowed to use whichever hospice you want. The interview several different providers, ask what services they offer. For the most part, the non-negotiables are the same across the board, but they might have some ancillary services like massage, a music therapist. The chaplain and social worker are part of the non-negotiables, but you might just ask them if they do pet therapy and things like that, if that's valuable to your loved one. And then learn about the philosophy of hospice. There's a lot of misunderstandings, including by my own father, who just misunderstood what hospice is, including some beliefs that maybe it's bad luck, or it's bad luck to even talk about it, or use the word, or things like that. So we have to learn what the rationale is behind it, and ultimately that it is focused on comfort care and being pain-free. It's not hastening death, but it's not rehabilitative either, right? So palliative care that we hear about sometimes is still rehabilitative. So a person could still be getting treatments and rehabs, rehabilitation. But with hospice, we've ended the rehabilitative part of things, and we're just keeping them comfortable. And you can start building your relationship with the professionals as soon as possible. And then you discuss with them medication coverage, the availability of durable medical equipment, which is like hospital beds, wheelchairs, all kinds of things that would typically be extremely expensive, but Medicare pays for that if a person is in hospice. And overall, whether in a memory care community or not, the benefit of just having more eyes on your loved one far supersedes anything that might be kind of scarier, new to you. It's so wonderful to just have additional nursing staff, caregiving staff, the chaplain, the social worker, all that, because they're not only there for your loved one, but they're also there for you. So that's really great. All right, so we want to make sure that we know the diagnosis, and I'm running out of time, so I want to allow some time for questions. There are different symptoms with different diagnosis. Dementia does not always stand alone, and they can get kind of tangled up with other medical issues, right? Or other dementias. So you can have more than one disease that's causing the dementia. And we always want to circle back to the professionals if we see sudden changes or have questions about behaviors or concerns, right? You're probably familiar with this umbrella, so maybe you've picked up on how I've been using my vocabulary around this topic. Dementia is not actually a diagnosis. Dementia is symptoms, right, of memory loss, impaired judgment, personality changes, and inability to perform some of your daily activities. And those examples that I gave earlier about they used to take care of their pet and they're not paying their bills, they're not keeping a clean home, they're not taking their meds right. Those are those activities of daily living that start to kind of be challenged. And then under this umbrella, there are actually well over 100 different diseases that cause dementia. These are kind of the big first five, Alzheimer's being the most common, 60 to 70% dementia cases. I actually just recently heard 70 to 80. Regardless of what the exact percentage is, it is the most common. Vascular dementia, it has connections to strokes or the blood vessels in the brain. And then frontal temporal dementia, Lewy body dementia, you've maybe heard of, other dementias, and the list goes on, right? So alcoholism, which can be Wernicke-Korsakoff disease, and Down syndrome, and chemotherapy, and anesthesia, and all these different things that might cause this memory loss and inability to perform daily activities. There's kind of two ways that we talk about the progression through the disease. There's this slow, steady decline like this. And then so once in a while, you'll hear a caregiver say, well, my loved one has been in a baseline for a while, and then something happened, like maybe they had an accident or they fell or a medical situation, and now they're at a new baseline for an indefinite amount of time. And then there's a change, and then there's a baseline. So just being aware that different caregivers report that there's kind of two different ways that they sense their loved one going through the journey. Because I find that just very interesting that there's a different vocabulary coming out of there, that it could be this slow, steady loss of they used to use a fork and now they can't. They used to get dressed on their own and now they can't. They used to brush their teeth and now they can't. It's this slow, steady loss, which feels like grief upon grief by a million little pricks, right? But that's a very different experience of what I hear of this kind of step down process. I'm going to skip this one because of time. Well, I do want to address the broken promises. So family members will often bring this up in support groups about how, like, they made me promise years ago that I was never going to do this, and yet here we are. They made me promise to never put them in a place like this. Number one, I think that those people or that generation or whatever kind of generalized term I want to use, maybe didn't realize that there's now more options. I just said this earlier today about back in the day, several generations back, all we knew was you're either home or you're in a very, very scary convalescent home, right? That's what we used to call them back then, or a nursing home, right? Now there's so many offerings of services, from in-home care, adult day services, supportive living in the state of Illinois, and on it goes, right? So assisted living before we get to a skilled care. And so that maybe would have made the conversation sound different. Also, would they have wanted you to promise that if they knew how hard it was to take care of somebody with dementia, right? So when we think about us aging, rarely do we talk about us having dementia. We always think that is more of a physical thing. And oftentimes family members are like, well, yeah, you can move into our house and we can make you meals and do your laundry and, housekeeping and all that kind of stuff. But we're not adding in all the other realities of taking care of somebody. And so we kind of have to think of, like, when I said that I would never bring them to a community like this or put them in a facility or a community, I like the word community better, was that tending to all the complexities of the conversation when it comes to dementia? Oftentimes not, right? In-home care and memory care are an extension of love, loving well, and caring for a diagnosed person in the very best ways. In fact, working in memory care, I often heard loved ones come up to me and say, why didn't I do this sooner? They see their loved ones, what I love the word thriving, by singing, dancing, arranging flowers, doing crafts, playing yard games, going out for ice cream, going to a movie, and doing all these things. And we can't help but to wonder, like, if they would have been at home, they would have been watching Wheel of Fortune and eating cheese and crackers all the time. So this is a better existence, that they're laughing and making friends and singing than sitting in the basement of my house. So that is not everybody's story, but that is a common story that I've experienced working in memory care. And we have to allow for some grace and forgiveness when advocating for their best interest, right? So sometimes we beat ourselves up for making big decisions and we feel guilty about that, but we have to remind ourselves that it was in their best interest. On the other side of placement, if that were to be your story, I've rarely heard regrets of placing somebody in memory care. And so there are different kinds of memory care, right? And so there are some better than others, but the whole idea of placing someone and getting them to a place where there's 15 people over 3 shifts doing the amount of work that you were doing as a caregiver all on your own at home is pretty significant, right? Often it improves the quality of life for both you and for them. You can kind of we talk about this, return to the role of spouse, partner, child, friend, neighbor, because the heavy lifting of the bathroom care and making food and sitting vigil to make sure that they don't leave the home, and all those kind of things becomes less of a focus. And this is a little bit controversial. Sometimes the person living with the diagnosis is happy to get a break from you as a caregiver. Sometimes when I say that to caregivers, they kind of look at me and they're like, huh, I never thought about them being sick and tired of me. And so once in a while, they like to be with their peers, and nobody, if they're in a dementia-friendly setting, nobody's telling them to don't go there. We can't go through that door. We're not allowed to do that. You know, you're not supposed to do that. But that's necessary when we have a loved one with dementia in our home, right? But when we become a part of a dementia-friendly community, a dementia-safe community, that what I say in this last line here, the architecture of the building cares for them in addition to the staff, right? So they can walk where they want to walk. Nobody's telling them they're in the wrong place at the wrong time. They shouldn't be there. And that is a sense of freedom that they're given that we sometimes just don't factor in. Everyone does the best they can. So if at some point after this conversation you're thinking, oh, maybe I haven't done something right, or I haven't thought through something the right way, we're all doing the best we can. And so we have to show ourselves some grace. We have to find the humor. The amount of laughter that comes out of some of our support groups is second to none, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, how many t-shirts do I want to get made based on the remarkable phrases that caregivers say? My favorite one was a lady said, being a caregiver to somebody with dementia is a lot like playing Chutes and Ladders and not even knowing the rules of the game. And I thought, there's a t-shirt or a sticker or a magnet or something there. So that fits. It makes perfect sense to me. But to find that kind of camaraderie with other caregivers is so vital. Ignore the naysayers. So there might be some people in your arena who are not helpful. And so we have to set some really good boundaries and say, this is not helpful. You can go ahead and keep your opinions to yourself, because I'm the one that's waking up in the middle of the night, or I'm the one that's paying the bill, or I'm the parent, you're the child. Zip it, you know? So sometimes we have to ignore the naysayers in our midst and look for the good in a moment. So taking advantage of those very small gifts that we've talked about. For example, a caregiver have said to me, they remembered I was their spouse instead of their child today, or their parent. They remembered my name. My favorite one was when a caregiver said, my husband hasn't thanked me for years, and the other day he came downstairs and said thank you, and she almost melted just by a simple thank you. So really paying attention to those small gifts along the way. And then know your limits and admit when you need help. So nobody's invincible. We talk about how often caregivers land up in the ER and the hospital themselves because of the stress of all of this. So just being self-aware and asking for help when we need it. All right. So this kind of is the end of my part. Is there anybody that has any questions or comments?
Okay, so if you have any questions, please either type it in the chat, or if you raise your hand, I can unmute you so that you can ask the question. Folks, some time to type. Well, we're giving folks a little bit of time. I want to thank you, LaVon, for such a fantastic presentation. And we are lucky enough to have you again next month. So on September 17th, we will have LaVon back. She's going to be doing Clarity is Kindness, What We May Be Doing Wrong in Dementia Caregiving. And it'll be at the same time, 6 o'clock Central. You want to talk a little bit about... Yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about what that one's going to entail?
Yeah, it's kind of one of my favorite ones, because basically it's just all different, like about 17 examples of things that have come up when I worked in memory care communities where caregivers maybe misunderstood what they were asking, or didn't know the full picture of a topic. And so it's kind of fun. For example, a caregiver reporting that my husband ate all my M&Ms, right? And he never ate sweets before, but learning that in dementia, sweet and salty start to taste better. And so her giant bag of Costco M&Ms disappeared. And we had to do some training because of the change of what tastes good, right, as we age. So that's a very simplified example, but it's just 17 fun examples of knowing all the sides of a topic.
Excellent. Good. So we do have a question. Cameron's asking, how do you help families have realistic expectations of what community living will look like?
That's a great question. There are some memory care communities around here who have actually set up champions from the community that will sit and talk with people who are considering moving their loved one into a memory care. And it's a little bit biased because, of course, the people that they're choosing are people that love that particular community. But they're also the people that made all those great big decisions and did all the research to land up there, right? And so maybe they have this decision bias that they now love the place where their loved one is, but at least they said, we went to I heard this. I went to 14 different places. We ruled out 7 of them by default. We knew that these 5 were possibilities. This one was closest to us. And so, having somebody sit and explain the process of how they got to where they are, and then being kind of honest. It reminds me of when I was single and I was looking for apartments. When I went to drive through the apartments, I would stop people in the parking lot and say, "Do you live here? What do you think about this place?" And so I think that's a really great way to get the inside scoop, because all the brochures are glossy and beautiful, right? And so we want to get past the brochures and past the sales, you might say, to be respectful, but get the real story of what's happening. I also think that meeting with a consultant in the local area, again, not the 1-800 numbers or the webinars, not the webinars, the websites that are nationwide, but a local consultant who can listen to what your loved one's needs are. Say your loved one was a farmer or a business owner or a manager or an electrician or engineer or whatever, or a gardener, or used to walk all the time, or getting to know the individual. And this consultant can say, you might want to look at these particular places because they have a beautiful middle courtyard and lots of room to move, and they can do some gardening there, versus other places that may not have that, right? So these consultants can kind of get to know an individual's preferences and then match you to a great fitting spot. So those are kind of 2 of my recommendations, but I think also the beauty that comes out of community support groups where peers are just completely unfiltered and honest with each other, of not particularly like discussing different communities, but the process of acclimating to living in a community, either from a house or from assisted living into a memory care and those kind of things. Does that help?
I think that was very helpful. Thank you. We don't have any other questions right now, but let's give a second. Jamie did put in the chat a recommended reading list that's from our website. So it has a lot of the books that are out there that you can read, some great ones. Chastity had put that was an excellent point about them not being told what to do and being around their peers when they move into a community. I think that makes a big difference, is that especially with someone who you might be seeing some depression or someone who's kind of reverting back into themselves at home, when we see them move into a community and they have that, they really gain independence by being in the community because they're, right, the community's built for them. So you tend to see them become more, like you said, engaged in the day-to-day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, strangely, there's a safety because they can move around as they wish. And if they actually land up liking it because they can do whatever they want for the most part. I mean, as long as they're safe, right? But it's a dementia-friendly environment. And so they feel that renewed sense of autonomy versus somebody saying, no, we're not going to go upstairs right now, or no, we're not going to go outside in the middle of the night, or, like what I call caregiving, but caregiving is a lot of directions. and at some point, we all get exhausted about that, right? No matter who we are.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Oh, here's one. What advice do you have for a family that wants their person with dementia to decide when it's time to move into a community?
That's actually, I don't think that's even really possible. That's where you want to have those conversations early on, right? At the beginning of the diagnosis. That's where they can go on tours with you. They can chime in about, oh, I would love an open courtyard. I would love a room with a window or a nice view. We tried the food there and I liked that food, but I didn't like the food at that other place. So you want to do the brunt of that kind of work early on, because later on, when they know, no longer have I want to say no longer have the ability, but really what I'm trying to say is, in the arena of dementia, some of the first things that are lost are logic and reasoning, along with memory, right? So if you go to 5 different places, that what comes easy for us of like making a pros and cons list, or even remembering what we saw versus what we're thinking that we remember that we saw, that becomes very skewed and really not reliable. That's they don't become good historians at some point, right? So you want to, if you want to engage them in that process, you want to do that in the very early stages, because at some point later on, if we're in a crisis situation where they don't really get too many choices about where we land up, because we're only going to one of these 3 places that have availability right now, they may not be able to speak to, but when we visited this place 8 months ago, I told you that I liked this. They wouldn't be able to do that, right? So my recommendation is that you do that as soon as possible if you really want them to participate in that process, where it might be more challenging. And the tricky part is that as you get closer to, down that progression, they might say no, 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 no to everything, right? Which is not going to help your decision-making process, because you're already feeling guilty that you're at the point where this might be needed. And so having them kind of be naysayers when it might be inevitable for their safety or health or whatever, that just makes things harder on you, where maybe you would even leave them at home while you go and tour the places. So every individual story is different, but that's kind of my thoughts on that.
Good. I mean, I think we could probably all count on one hand how many times one of our residents actually had said, okay, it's time for me to make the move.
Yes, right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I even had that on a slide and I forgot to say it, but like rarely has anybody ever said today's a great day to move into memory care, or go to adult day services or in-home care. At some point, maybe they acclimate, and then your thank you will say, will sound like, I want to go home to my memory care community. And that's the best thank you you're ever going to hear, that they want to go home to, Anthem Churchill. So, but yeah, very rarely, if ever, it's typically the crisis that happens that springs us into that next stage.
Mm-hmm. Good. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat, and no one's raising their hand. So want to thank you again for your presentation today. And as a reminder, we'll have our next one on Wednesday, September 17th. LaVon will be back, and it'll be on Clarity is Kindness, what we may be doing wrong in dementia caregiving. And that'll be start at 6 p.m. Central Time. This webinar has been recorded, and we will be posting it on our YouTube channel, on our Facebook pages. It's probably sometime tomorrow, and then in about a week, it'll be up on our website, so that if you have anyone that you think could benefit from the program, please feel free to share it. Share it with your family members. It's there for you to, we try to do this free education so that you can share with your friends and family.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much.
We're going to sign off. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
All right. Bye-bye.